Welcome back. So, Deputy President Paul Mashatile has finally broken his silence on the future of South African Airways. Mashatile says government is not in the business of owning airlines and should consider selling. Last week, the Minister of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, Marupeni Ramakgopa, came out strongly against the sale of equity in state entities, including SAA, to the private sector. But is selling SAA the way forward? Let's bring in aviation analyst Dr. Guy Leitch. Dr. Leitch, good morning to you. Thank you so much for the time that you're giving us. Are you surprised that this is where we are with this conversation just a few weeks into a seventh administration, and the conversation around public enterprises now being, well, perhaps we should be looking at the sale of SAA?
Yeah, well, I think it is surprising, but what is surprising is that government hasn't got its act together. Government doesn't know what its own policies are in this regard. So we're seeing these two very different pronouncements. But I think that congratulations must be given and recognition must be given to Paul Mashatile, Deputy President Paul Mashatile, because he's the only realist in the room. The fact of the matter is that SAA has, by its own admission, a number of times said that it cannot grow without a partner, without recapitalization. It doesn't have the funds available by itself to grow, so it has to have a partner. And quite frankly, in terms of the history of government intervention with SAA over the past 50 years, there's absolutely no case to be made for having a state-owned airline in South Africa.
Yeah, you know, I almost want to sit a little bit more with that why that you've given us, and I know you've started. And the reason why is because I think the issue of certainly privatization of our public or state-owned entities has been, I mean, to say contentious is really an understatement over the past few years. Is that to say that there simply is no way that SAA under public share ownership can recover?
No, that's not true. I think it's got a reasonably competent management team in place. Right now, it's still looking for talent, and it could find that talent. However, it's constrained. And the reality is that 40 years ago, airlines or governments around the world realized that, as Mashatile said, government has no place in running airlines or no business in running airlines. Airlines are traditionally incredibly skills intensive. They have very thin margins, so you've got to be incredibly efficient, and they are incredibly capital intensive. And our government doesn't have any of those skills to add to the airline. So while there are examples of successful state-owned airlines, most notably Ethiopian and Africa and Singapore Airlines, that's not going to work for South Africa, because we've got this ongoing, and I say ongoing, practice of government intervention in airlines. As I speak right now, there's a war brewing with the air service licensing councils, which by all accounts seem to be set up to protect SAA and try and protect it from losing routes that it's not even using. This is very bad for the economy. It's very bad for tourism. It's very bad for economic growth. But this is what happens when you have governments protecting their own airlines. So Mashatile is 100% correct. The airline should be privatized. Unfortunately, I believe the Tatoo Consortium deal was actually subverted or railroaded, if you like, by Minister Pravin Gordhan, who had no intention of actually selling off the airline. You know, there's this notion that airlines are like the family silver. You just don't get rid of them. But there's no case to be made whatsoever for so-called flag carriers anymore. With interlining and code sharing, you can fly on an SAA ticket and you'll be flying on an entirely different airline. The reality is, if we're going to be modern and up-to-date in government, we cannot actually afford SAA any longer.
Yeah, I mean, I want to read what essentially the Deputy President has said. I wouldn't mind resuscitating SAA as a state-owned company, but my approach would be to partner with the private sector, because I don't think the government will have the money to run it, right? And then he says this actually could have been done a lot earlier. I mean, it's an interesting tone there that's used by the Deputy President, something that could have been done a lot earlier. But there's, of course, the question around what model is used to bring the private sector in. What would you foresee, for instance, as the options that are available?
Well, it's a tricky one, because there's currently a 25% limit on foreign ownership of South African airlines. And we see that right now. There's an ongoing spat between FlySafair and the other airlines about Fly SAA having more than a 25% foreign ownership. So it would be very difficult to replicate the model, for instance, with Qatar partnering with Rwanda Air, for example. But that is probably the model that needs to be followed right now. During COVID and the whole business rescue process, SAA lost a tremendous amount of ground. It literally had its market share eaten by the other airlines. And it's going to really struggle to get those those routes back. It doesn't have the capital to buy new aircraft, and it can't compete without buying new aircraft. So it has to have a capital partner. Whether this is the so-called partnership emphasized by Ramaphosa, or whether it's actually a sell-off, is a moot point. But I'm very concerned about Ramaphosa's proposal that the airline SAA be put in a special holding company with a whole bunch of other, quite frankly, toxic state-owned enterprises. To me, all that's going to happen is that all the losses will get buried into one lump sum number, and you won't be able to know. You won't know what's making the losses where. Another bad idea. As I said, the bottom line here is that we cannot go forward. Yes, we can have an SAA, but I certainly believe it has to have at least a majority shareholding from another airline, or at least private sector operators who will introduce the necessary disciplines, the necessary capital, and the necessary skill to enable the airline to be able to begin to fulfill its potential. And let me just say very quickly that we do need the airline. We do need an airline that will develop routes that might take a little while to grow. We do need an airline to feed into Africa, to bring the world to Africa as it used to do. And if we don't have it, then every ticket that's bought, the money goes overseas to the UAE or to Lufthansa or wherever else. There's a good case to be made to have a local SAA type airline, but it shouldn't be private. It must be private owned.
So, and I must ask, because curiously, I'm sure people are wondering where Tatoo Consortium would fit into this discussion. Do we go back to them?
No, I don't think the Tatoo Consortium deal was correctly structured. It was appropriate at the time it was announced, when that was literally immediately post business rescue process. And the 3 billion rand so-called dowry, which was just going to be an injection of operating capital, was seen to be quite useful. SAA has come a long way since then in the last 3 years or so. It needs far more than 3 billion rand injection of operating capital. And also the key component of the Tatoo Consortium, or one of the key components of the Tatoo Consortium, was Global Airways, which was going to bring in much needed skills and route development and so on. That part was ruled out of bounds by the Competition Commission. So in the end, it was just going to bring in supposedly the 3 billion rands worth of capital. SAA needs far more money than that. It costs around about 6 billion rand to simply buy one wide-body airliner like an Airbus A350. So it's got to get a really deep-pocket investor, and it can be done.
I want to talk a little bit about what I suppose the lower hanging fruit would be for South African Airways, right? Well, we certainly will talk about whether or not we continue this debate around whether to sell or work with private sector to take SAA forward. We know that in this country that could be quite a lengthy discussion. In the meantime, though, what are the opportunities for South African Airways? And I say again, the lower hanging fruit. There is, of course, the debate around whether or not they focus on domestic. And you've touched on the issue of them simply not having the capacity, them not having the money to buy aircrafts. They've gotten about the route of continuing to lease aircrafts. And if you will, feed my curiosity there about just what aircrafts we do have that we own and what we're leasing. But what are the green shoots that they can be really feeding and watering?
The east-west connection to Australia to Perth and to South America through Sao Paulo are the key routes here. And the Perth route in particular is of note because SAA doesn't have the aircraft to operate that route at what we could call a critical mass. It's only flying, if I'm not mistaken, 3 times a week. And that's not sufficient to feed a route. Most people want to go on a specific day. Otherwise, they'll travel somewhere else. So SAA needs to have at least a daily a route to Perth. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. So that is obviously an absolute first key step. And then the airline wants to get back into Europe, and it can do that. It's looking to get back into Frankfurt, but not Munich. And it's particularly looking to get back into the historically very profitable, what was called the Springbok route, which is the Johannesburg-London route. That route, there's definitely very much low-hanging fruit. I'm personally dubious about the airline's ability to get back into the United States. I mean, we've seen Delta and United pretty much carve up Joburg and Cape Town between them, so SAA is going to really battle to do that. And again, it doesn't have the aircraft to be able to do that. And quite frankly, going via Accra in West Africa is not really an option when people can fly non-stop. But there's also a lot of further opportunity going further east. I really think that the airline needs to do another good case study on Mumbai. That was a really political hot potato due to the Gupta influence in the airline. So I think there's a good opportunity there. So what with Europe and filling out the existing routes, I think that there's at least another 5 years worth of good expansion immediately available for the airline.
Yeah, just before I let you go, and I think it'd be difficult for me to let you go without having this discussion with you. You've got now, and we talk about all the time, this new 7th administration, and certainly with the cabinet announcement from the president a few weeks ago, the understanding that now SOEs would report to the departments in line with what that SOE does, and not necessarily the department, and not the department, not necessarily, just not the Department of Public Enterprises. Does that provide a leadership vacuum for you, in your view?
It does. You know, again, I've said before, I said earlier in this discussion, that an airline is a very skills-intensive business. You cannot have a government department that doesn't understand the industry. And that's what you have if you don't have a specific government department literally in charge of SAA. And so we've seen SAA being an orphan in government, being either managed by the State-owned Enterprises Department, which did it very poorly, and then for a while by the Department of Finance. So SAA it's just another reason why the South African government will never be able to actually run an airline, and it needs to actually be able to wash its hands of it. I mean, imagine if instead of spending 50 billion rand, which is what SAA has cost the South African taxpayer over the last 20 years, imagine if it was actually making money, paying money back into the fiscus through making profits. And honestly, it can do that. We look at examples like Air New Zealand. 7 or 8 years ago, Air New Zealand was the same size as SAA. Yeah. Now it's a far bigger airline, and let me point out that it's profitable as well. SAA can get there.
All right, Guy, thank you so much for speaking to us. We really, really do appreciate it. Dr. Guy Leitch, the aviation analyst, speaking to us and responding to utterances by Deputy President Paul Mashatile that he feels that SAA really should be looking at working with the private sector. Right.